Did you know that an entire empire has been quietly erased from the pages of history? Once upon a time, if you opened almost any map drawn between the 1500s and the 1800s, you would find a vast territory boldly labeled Tartaria or Grand Tartary. This was no minor kingdom, no forgotten province, no vague borderland. We are talking about an empire that stretched from the edges of Eastern Europe deep across the heart of Asia. A landmass so enormous that it dominated the maps of its age. From the Caspian Sea all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and from the frozen reaches of Siberia down into the steppes of Central Asia, Tartaria stood as one of the largest continuous territories ever recorded on European maps. And then, almost overnight, it vanished, not gradually. Not through conquest that was carefully documented. Not through a slow decline recorded by historians. It simply disappeared, wiped from the maps, omitted from the textbooks, and erased from the collective memory of the modern world. What happened to this once magnificent civilization? Did it fade away through natural causes, the way so many empires have throughout history? Or is there something far stranger, far more deliberate, behind its sudden vanishing? We are going to explore that mystery together in this new episode of Secret Origins. Welcome. Before we dive into the deeper conspiracy, let's begin with the most undeniable evidence of all, the maps themselves. For more than 3 full centuries, European cartographers consistently depicted a massive region called Tartaria, or Grand Tartary. These were not crude sketches or imaginative fantasy maps drawn by people who had never left their home villages. French mapmakers, Dutch mapmakers, German mapmakers, British mapmakers, nation after nation produced detailed charts that agreed on the location, the scale, and the internal divisions of this empire. You will see labels such as Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Russian Tartary. That alone suggests something more complex than a single vague territory. It points to multiple related regions, possibly different political or cultural zones within one greater Tartarian sphere. The consistency is striking. When mapmakers from rival nations, working with different sources of information and different political interests, all show essentially the same vast landmass in the same place for generation after generation, it becomes very difficult to dismiss the entire thing as a simple error or a shared myth. Yet sometime in the 1800s, Tartaria began to vanish from the maps. Not slowly, not through a series of careful revisions that reflected changing borders. It disappeared with a suddenness that feels almost intentional. As if someone decided that this empire should no longer be allowed to exist on paper. Hundreds of historical maps spanning 3 centuries had documented it. Then, within a relatively short span of time, modern atlases contained no trace of it. Geography textbooks never mentioned it. School children grew up never hearing the name. It is as if an entire chapter of world history was carefully torn out of the book and the remaining pages were glued back together so neatly that most people never noticed the gap, if Tartaria had merely been a loose term for scattered nomadic tribes. Why go to such lengths to erase it so thoroughly? And more importantly, what happened to the grand cities, the territories, and the infrastructure that those old maps so clearly indicated? The answer may be more unsettling than you expect. Around the same period that Tartaria was disappearing from maps, something extraordinary was happening across America and Europe. Suddenly, magnificent buildings began appearing everywhere. Massive structures of stone and iron filled with intricate details, classical columns, ornate domes, and craftsmanship that still challenges modern engineers. Government buildings, train stations, exhibition halls, courthouses, and entire city centers rose with astonishing speed during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The question that keeps returning is simple. Where did the builders acquire such advanced knowledge and such rapid construction capability? The official timeline does not always add up. Consider San Francisco in 1906. A devastating earthquake and the fires that followed reduced large parts of the city to rubble. Yet within just a few short years, the city was rebuilt with structures of remarkable quality and ambition. Knowing the full impact of a disaster on that scale, recovery should have taken far longer. Resources were limited. Skilled labor was finite. Materials had to be transported. Yet somehow the city rose again with buildings that continue to impress architects today. Some researchers have begun to ask whether outside knowledge, or even outside labor, played a role. Could remnants of Tartarian expertise have been involved? Then there is the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Official records state that the famous White City, more than 600 acres of elaborate neoclassical buildings, was designed and constructed in only 2 years. 2 years. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts building alone covered 44 acres under a single roof. Its central hall was so vast that it could have contained the U.S. Capitol, the Great Pyramid of Giza, Winchester Cathedral, Madison Square Garden, and St. Paul's Cathedral all at once, with space still remaining. The ironwork was intricate. The glass exteriors were complex. The structural engineering was sophisticated. And we are asked to accept that this entire complex was raised from open land in less than 24 months, using the technology and labor force of the 1890s. The official explanation claims these were temporary structures built from plaster and stuff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber. Yet the surviving photographs show buildings that look anything but temporary. The scale, the precision, the visual weight of the architecture suggest permanent construction of the highest order. And then shortly after the exposition ended, almost every one of those extraordinary buildings was demolished. The reason given was that they had only ever been intended as temporary. But think carefully about that explanation. If a city or a nation invests enormous amounts of money, material, and skilled labor into creating structures of that quality, why would it immediately tear them down? The decision feels irrational, unless the true purpose was something else entirely. Tartarian researchers offer a different interpretation. They suggest that many of these buildings were not newly constructed for the fairs at all. Instead, they already existed. The theory holds that an advanced Tartarian civilization had left behind a legacy of superior architecture across continents. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, authorities renovated or rebranded these existing structures for the world's fairs, displayed them to the public, and then deliberately destroyed them afterward, removing the last visible evidence of a civilization that was not supposed to have existed. Look at the architectural style itself. Buildings from Chicago, San Francisco, St. Petersburg, and many other cities of the era share remarkably consistent design elements. The same classical columns, the same ornate domes, the same precise stonework, the same sense of proportion and grandeur. How does one explain that level of stylistic unity across different nations, different construction crews, and different decades, unless the original builders were connected by a common tradition and a common knowledge base? The theory grows even more ambitious. Some researchers claim that the Tartarian Empire did not simply disappear. It was buried. Walk through almost any major city built before 1900 and you will notice something strange. Buildings that appear to be sinking into the ground. First floors that have become basements. Windows that now sit at sidewalk level, staring up at passers-by like the eyes of something half-buried. Tartaria theorists call this the evidence of the Great Mud Flood. According to the theory, sometime in the 1800s, a catastrophic geological event struck large parts of the world. Layers of mud and debris buried hundreds of Tartarian cities, leaving only the upper stories of the buildings visible. The original ground floors disappeared beneath the new street level. In Seattle, entire blocks of buildings show their original first floors buried beneath a modern street. The Seattle Underground is often presented as a quirky tourist attraction, yet researchers argue it is physical proof that the city once stood on a completely different elevation. Similar patterns appear in New York's older subway excavations and in many other cities across North America and Europe. Construction crews occasionally uncover elaborate architectural features far below the present ground level. Features that look deliberate, precise, and far older than the official construction dates. Mainstream historians offer a simpler explanation. Ordinary urban development. Streets are paved and repaved. New foundations are laid on top of old ones. Ground levels rise gradually over decades. New entrances are cut at the current street level. That process is real and well documented. Yet Tartarian researchers insist the scale of the burial is too extreme, too consistent, and too widespread to be explained by gradual rise alone. Entire floors disappear. Windows that once looked out at street level now look up from below it. And the timing coincides almost perfectly with the period when Tartaria was vanishing from the maps. The World's Fairs of the late 1800s and early 1900s take on a darker meaning under this interpretation. Rather than pure celebrations of progress, they may have served as elaborate cover-ups. How do you hide an entire lost civilization and its magnificent buildings? One method is to claim you built them yourself, display them to the world under the banner of a temporary exposition, and then demolish them once the public has seen them. The lack of detailed construction photographs for many of these fair buildings only deepens the suspicion. We possess abundant images of the finished structures and of their later demolition, yet remarkably few clear records of the actual building process. Then, there are the star forts. These geometric structures with precise angular bastions appear across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. Official history classifies them as military fortifications designed to withstand cannon fire. Yet many of the designs follow mathematical proportions and alignments that seem excessive for simple defense. Some researchers argue the angles, the proportions, and the placement suggest a different purpose: the channeling or focusing of energy, perhaps acoustic or electromagnetic. The same researchers point to the extraordinary acoustic properties of many grand buildings from the same era. Cathedrals, government halls, and public buildings often possess resonance that feels almost supernatural. Voices carry with unusual clarity. Sounds amplify and linger. Tartaria theorists propose that these spaces were designed as resonance chambers, environments engineered to work with sound, frequencies for technological ends that we no longer understand. Recent scientific work has shown that certain frequencies can influence matter at the molecular level, levitate small objects, or alter the properties of materials. If an earlier civilization had mastered such principles, it could explain how massive stone structures were raised with such precision and speed. It could also explain the stylistic consistency across continents, and it would supply a powerful motive for erasure. Free energy technology, the ability to power cities without coal, oil, or nuclear fuel, would threaten the entire economic foundation of the modern industrial world. No government of the emerging industrial age would have welcomed that knowledge remaining in public hands, which brings us to the most startling claim of all. The Tartarians themselves may have been giants. Walk through the grand buildings of that era, and the proportions often feel wrong for ordinary human beings. Doorways rise 12, 15, even 20 feet high. Staircases feature steps so deep that a person of average height must stretch uncomfortably to climb them. Ceilings soar far higher than modern standards of comfort or efficiency would require. Mainstream explanations speak of grandeur for grandeur*s sake. Architecture meant to awe visitors. Tartaria researchers offer another possibility. These spaces were designed for inhabitants who were significantly taller than modern humans. Photographs and records from the late 1800s sometimes show furniture that appears oversized. Chairs, with seats positioned unusually high, tables of exaggerated scale, beds that look massive even in luxurious settings. Newspaper reports from the same period across America describe discoveries of giant skeletons during construction, mining, and excavation work. The Smithsonian and other institutions of the time recorded acquisitions of unusually large human remains. Heights of 7, 8, and even 9 feet were mentioned. Yet if you search major museum collections today for these remains, they are nowhere to be found. Researchers claim the bones were removed from public view, destroyed, or locked away in inaccessible storage. Cultural memory adds another layer. Nearly every ancient tradition speaks of giants. The Titans of Greek myth, the Nephilim of the Bible, the enormous warriors of Norse legend, the giant races in Native American oral histories. What if these stories are not pure invention but distant cultural memories of real encounters with a taller, more advanced people? If such a civilization existed and possessed both physical stature and technological knowledge far beyond the official timeline, its complete disappearance would require an explanation equal to the scale of the erasure. Tartaria theorists call that process the Great Reset. Not the modern economic phrase, but an older, more deliberate effort to rewrite the historical record. They point to a cluster of catastrophic events in the late 19th and early 20th centuries: the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, the First World War, the Spanish flu pandemic, and the Second World War. Mainstream history treats these as separate tragedies. Conspiracy researchers ask whether some of them may have served a dual purpose: the destruction of physical evidence and the disruption of any remaining continuity with the older world. Even the empty streets visible in many Late 19th century photographs of major cities have been drawn into the discussion. Wide boulevards and grand public squares often appear nearly deserted. The conventional explanation is long camera exposure times that cause moving people to vanish from the image, combined with genuinely lower population densities. That explanation accounts for much of what we see. Yet the cumulative effect of empty avenues, vacant plazas, and cities that look like abandoned stage sets continues to fuel speculation. So we return to the central question: what happened to Grand Tartary? Was it a misunderstood name for various Asian peoples that cartographers simply stopped using? Was it a real political entity that faded through ordinary historical processes? Or was something far larger and more intentional at work? The systematic removal of an advanced civilization, its architecture, its technology, and even its physical remains from the official story of humanity. The maps remain. The buildings remain. The buried floors remain. The impossible construction timelines remain. The acoustic properties remain. The oversized proportions remain. And the silence of the history books remains. You tell us what you think in the comments. If this exploration has made you look at the old maps and the old buildings with new eyes, consider liking the video and subscribing so you never miss a new episode. And if the mystery of Tartaria has captured your attention, wait until you hear about Mu, the even older mother civilization that some researchers claim preceded Tartaria itself. Tap the video on screen and continue the journey. Keep your minds open. Question the official timelines. Look carefully at what the physical evidence still shows. Until we meet again.